Rome has long been called the Eternal City, a testament not only to its antiquity, as there are many cities that can trace their founding back much farther, but the fact that its allure and grandeur, as well as the resilience of the Romans themselves, have made it all but impossible to destroy. Perhaps more than any other city, Rome has had its highs and lows, but no matter what, it is a given that the Roman people will endure and rebuild in the face of any adversity. Over the millennia, Rome has faced destruction by foreign invasions, from the Gallic sack in 390 BCE to the troops of Charles V in 1527. But until modern times, the most enduring threat to the city and its most frequent destroyer was fire. Though the ancient city was ravaged by countless conflagrations, the Great Fire of 64 that struck during the reign of Nero is best remembered not just for the severe destruction it wrought, but for its impact upon urban design, economics, imperial politics, and even religion in ways that no one who survived the blaze could have ever predicted. The fact that the final few remnants of ancient Roman architecture are all constructed of enduring materials, such as stone, marble, and brick, could lead the casual observer to the conclusion that the ancient city was primarily constructed of these materials. However, despite Augustus's boast that he had found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble, most buildings of Rome in 64 relied heavily on flammable materials to meet the needs of the city's 1 million inhabitants. To make matters worse, there were no fire codes, so Rome's shoddily built urban sprawl and tight alleyways were incredibly conducive to feeding any conflagration that broke out in the city. But fire was a daily necessity for cooking, heating, and even just for illumination after sundown, so it's no surprise that smaller blazes frequently broke containment and, depending on the neighborhood of origin, could rapidly consume entire blocks. Roman apprehension about soldiers in the city also prevented the formation of a true fire brigade. The hesitation was born of the old Republican fear that an organized group of men armed with axes could be used in a coup to overthrow the senatorial order. With the state refusing to act, firefighting during the Republic was limited to disjointed private efforts that never came anywhere close to providing adequate protection to the city. Instead, these small outfits would limit themselves to protecting the property of those who paid. The triumvir Marcus Crassus would tweak this tradition when he unveiled a well-trained team of slaves who quickly became the most talented team of dedicated firefighters that the city had ever seen. But he wasn't motivated by civic charity or even the desire to profit off insurance payments. Instead, his fire brigade was used to build his real estate portfolio. He would show up to the site of an active fire and offer to douse the blaze, but only if the owner sold him the property for a minute fraction of its value. You don't become the richest man in Rome through ethical business practices. During the Principate, Augustus would found the Vigiles, a cohort of urban watchmen that combined the duties of a fire brigade and a police force. This group was dedicated to fighting fires throughout the city wherever they arose, but they still lacked the tools necessary to do much more than starve the fires by knocking down surrounding buildings and constructing fire breaks. Though primitive water pumps and vinegar-soaked blankets were employed, they were rarely effective at saving a building once it had started to burn. Rome's unpreparedness would catch up with her on the evening of July 18th, 64, when Tacitus tells us that the fire began at the Circus Maximus. This was an ill omen for Rome, as the massive chariot racing stadium was by far the largest wooden structure in the city. Worse yet, it was centrally positioned within the old core of Rome, and its proximity to the river meant that a strong summer breeze soon carried embers from the blaze throughout the city. This wind and the dry conditions of summer in the Italian heartland proved to be the decisive factors that transformed the fire into the apocalyptic event that it was to become. Tacitus described the chaotic outbreak in his Annals.
It took its rise in the part of the circus touching the Palatine and Caelian hills, where, Among the shops packed with inflammable goods, the conflagration broke out, gathered strength in the same moment, and, impelled by the wind, swept the full length of the circus, for there were neither mansions screened by boundary walls, nor temples surrounded by stone enclosures, nor obstructions of any description to bar its progress. The flames, which in full career overran the level districts first, then shot up to the heights and sank again to harry the lower parts, kept ahead of all remedial measures, the mischief traveling fast, and the town being an easy prey owing to the narrow, twisting lanes and formless streets typical of old Rome.
Given the flammable materials around Rome, modern forensic science estimates that a citywide conflagration such as this could have reached 1,100 degrees, hot enough for wood to combust without direct contact to flame. Melted nails discovered by archaeologists indicate that by the time the fire reached the Forum, it had reached incredibly high temperatures. The large number of coins found in the corresponding ash layer demonstrate that the blaze spread so quickly that Romans either ran off without collecting their money or were consumed en masse in the Forum itself. It's a scene of incomprehensible horror. A city which had once been home to 1 million souls transformed into a never-ending labyrinth of flame. Imagine gathering your family and a few precious possessions to fight your way through the flames and the falling beams and the suffocating smoke and blinding ash, the hairs singeing off of your arms and legs, off of your children's, all in a blind and desperate search for another part of the city where someone had said there was no fire. You couldn't have traveled fast. You likely would have lost friends, family on the way. It could have taken several days. Your mouth parched, but the city's fountains all hopelessly befouled by soot, ash, debris, and even bloated corpses. Your lips cracking from the heat. Raw blisters from the desperate moments in which tongues of flame had lapped at your skin. At long last, barely standing, you and your remaining loved ones cheer yourselves with the thought that soon you'll be in a safer place, a part of the city to which the fire had not yet traveled. And then, the crushing realization at journey's end, as your body seems to lose its capacity to sweat, that the safe neighborhood, too, is fully ablaze. It was all for nothing. There will be no shelter here. The inferno would burn for 6 days straight, claiming thousands of lives and scorching a path of destruction across 70% of the city. Of the city's 14 administrative districts, only 4 would emerge unscathed. 3 of the 10 affected were said to have been totally destroyed, with not a single upright building remaining. It's difficult to properly understand the human scope of this tragedy. Tacitus recounts,
Shrieking and terrified women, fugitives stricken or immature in years, men consulting their own safety or the safety of others as they dragged the infirm along or paused to wait for them, combined by their own dilatoriness or their haste to impede everything. Often, while they glanced back to the rear, they were attacked on the flanks or in front, or, if they had made their escape into a neighboring quarter, that was also involved in the flames, and even districts which they had believed remote from danger were found to be in the same plight. At last, irresolute, what to avoid or what to seek, they crowded into the roads or threw themselves down in the fields. Some, who had lost the whole of their means, their daily bread included, chose to die, though the way of escape was open, and were followed by others through love for their relatives whom they had proved unable to rescue.
The vast majority of Romans owned scarcely more than the clothes on their backs, and what little they did have would have been consumed along with their meager dwellings. In a city reduced to soot and ash, food and shelter would have been incredibly difficult to come by for the thousands of penniless survivors, particularly those now orphaned or widowed. There was no social safety net in Rome, and the after effects of the fire were surely as devastating to the people of Rome as the blaze itself. To the pious Romans, nearly any natural phenomenon could be interpreted as an auspice or a divine omen. The aftermath of the blaze would therefore have also been accompanied by extreme existential angst. What wickedness had provoked such unprecedented divine wrath? The very homes of the gods themselves had been destroyed. What did it mean? Were they abandoning Rome? What could possibly be done to appease their fury? In their desolation, the Roman people sought a scapegoat, someone or something that they could condemn as the cause of their newfound misery. Nero would soon discover that rumor was the only thing that spread faster than flame. Some wondered aloud if he was responsible for the blaze. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio all lay the blame for the fire at Nero's feet, but their accounts were written well after the fire, and are likely more reflective of Nero's dismal legacy than actual popular opinion in the immediate aftermath of the fire. But, to some extent, blame for the fire must have weighed on Nero's mind, as he went out of his way to care for those who had been made homeless by the fire, personally taking charge of relief efforts and erecting temporary housing on the Campus Martius and even his own private gardens. He also saw to it that rudimentary building codes were enacted during the reconstruction of the city, placing wider avenues between apartment blocks and taking other steps to ensure that no similar fires occurred. Whatever the public's perceptions may have been, it's almost certain that Nero had not, in fact, started the fire. Unlike their ancient Roman counterparts, modern historians universally reject the idea that the emperor had set his own capital ablaze. Nero had been in the seaside resort town of Antium when the fire erupted, and his own imperial palace on the Palatine, and all the priceless treasures contained within, was one of the first buildings to burn. Nero was an enthusiastic libertine at the time of the fire, but his most debauched and notorious excesses were still years away, and there would have been no real reason for him to destroy the city. There's little benefit in being an emperor of ash. And though history does not record him as a pious man, even Nero would have balked at the prospect of destroying the temples of the gods, from whom divine favor was granted not just to Rome, but to him personally. One of the biggest factors driving the rumors of Nero's culpability was how rapidly and erratically the fire had spread. Romans lacked knowledge of phenomena like updrafts or heat thresholds, the latter of which meant that at sufficient heat, buildings could combust, even if isolated from the flames. The fact that some members of the Vigiles evidently engaged in looting instead of fighting the fire didn't help his case. While we don't know the full extent to which Romans believed rumors that Nero was behind the fire, it is clear, from even a passing familiarity with his biography, that Nero had a pathological need to be loved. And it's not hard to imagine why he sought to point the blame elsewhere. In time, he would make a bizarre new Eastern cult into the real perpetrators of the blaze. Nero would have had very little knowledge of who these Christians were, or the content of their beliefs, but he would have known that they were viewed as an oddity, even by the city's Jewish population, which was itself quite distinct from the Romans. Having blamed the Christians for the fire, he sought out members of the small church in Rome and had them killed, with many being subjected to the traditional Roman punishment for arsonists, being burnt alive.
Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle, and was exhibiting a show in the circus, while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty, that they were being destroyed.
It's important to note that Nero's efforts were not an empire-wide persecution or a campaign to wipe Christianity off the face of the earth. He was simply punishing the community in Rome itself, as they were the alleged perpetrators of the fire. Understandably, though, the early Christians were not reassured by this distinction, and Nero was immortalized in the Book of Revelation as the Antichrist, a literary figure who has come in the Western tradition to represent evil incarnate. In an irony of history, the true responsibility for the Great Fire of Rome does not rest with the Christians, the group who was immediately blamed for the blaze, nor with Nero, the man who has been remembered by posterity as the arsonist. In truth, the tragic fire was simply the result of natural forces combined with decades of poor urban planning by people who were conscious of the dangers. But the human mind seeks a scapegoat, and would rather identify a nefarious enemy acting with intent to make our lives worse than accept the even more frightening reality that for individuals and empires alike, so much is utterly beyond our control. Nero's efforts to quash the expanding Christian church would prove to be a failure, and despite his extensive efforts to care for the victims of the fire, whatever his motivations may have been, Nero would soon devote considerably more resources to the construction of a new palace to replace the one destroyed in the fire. The Golden House, as it came to be known, occupied 300 acres of the best real estate in Rome and gave a new meaning to opulence and indulgence. By far the most magnificent residence ever constructed in the city, the scale of the building necessitated significantly higher taxes across the empire, and the decadence of an emperor increasingly unmoored from any conception of modesty or morality would lead to a plot to depose him just 1 year after the fire. In a sign of the changing times, this conspiracy, led by senators, would prove unsuccessful, and Nero would ultimately perish in 68 after provincial governors rose up in defiance of his heavy taxes. The Senate no longer had the power to effect change, even by violent means. The Republic was long dead, and it was provincial commanders who would emerge as the real power players in imperial politics. The Fire of 64 did ultimately spell doom for Nero, but not because it turned popular opinion against him. His efforts to deflect blame generally seemed to have worked, and it was only the senatorial elite that continued to bear a grudge years later. The fire would eventually destroy him all the same, not because it limited him, but because it made him more free than ever. He could indulge himself, and did. His missteps and excesses in the aftermath of the fire would precipitate the fall of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and the succession crisis following his death would lead to the year of the 4 emperors, plunging the already stricken empire into the crucible of civil war. But the people of Rome would endure even these trials, and the end of the Julio-Claudians paved the way for the prosperous 2nd century, which is widely viewed as the zenith of Roman civilization. The Roman people watched it all happen, and regardless of whether or not Fortuna was smiling on the city during their lifetime, the Romans persisted. It was the only option they had, and really, all they know how to do.
Hi, Gaius here. Thanks for being part of our efforts to shed light on the more obscure topics related to the fascinating world of the ancient Romans. If you enjoyed Titus's work here, please do us a favor by liking and subscribing. Gratias vobis ago.